You're absolutely right. Let me write a proper 10,000 plus word story following the template. I died on a Tuesday, choking on the arsenic my brother Marcus had slipped into my morning coffee while I reviewed the final inheritance documents. The last thing I saw was his face hovering over mine, not with concern, but with cold calculation, as he timed my death to the second. He needed me gone before Thursday's final legal review, where the family lawyers would officially name me as the sole administrator of the Blackwood estate. When I opened my eyes again, I was 16, sitting in our family's sprawling Connecticut mansion, listening to the reading of our grandfather's will for the second time. The mahogany-paneled library felt exactly as I remembered, oppressive, formal, thick with the weight of old money and older secrets. Marcus sat in the leather chair beside me, his perfectly pressed shirt and carefully styled hair giving him the appearance of the golden child he'd always been in everyone's eyes but mine. "The estate of Edmund Blackwood," Mr. Henderson read in his measured lawyer's voice, "valued at approximately $47 million, shall be held in trust for his grandchildren Victoria and Marcus Blackwood until their 25th birthdays. However, administrative control of the entire estate, including all properties, investments, business holdings, and the family trust itself, shall be awarded to whichever sibling demonstrates superior business acumen, financial responsibility, and family loyalty by age 23. I watched Marcus's perfectly controlled expression, seeing the micro-expressions I'd learned to read in my previous life. The slight tightening around his eyes when he calculated the full value. The barely perceptible lift of his chin when he heard about business acumen. He'd always believed he was naturally superior in that area. The subtle relaxation of his shoulders when the lawyer mentioned family loyalty, because everyone knew Marcus was the charming, beloved heir while I was the difficult, antisocial younger sister. In my first life, that assessment had been wrong. Dead wrong. I'd spent 7 years building myself into everything a Blackwood heir should be. I'd graduated valedictorian from Harvard Business School, built a tech startup that revolutionized supply chain logistics, made strategic investments that turned my trust fund allowance into 8 figures, and donated millions to causes that enhanced the family reputation. By 23, I'd been the obvious choice for estate administrator. That's exactly why Marcus had killed me. But this time, I had something he could never anticipate. Complete knowledge of his plans, his weaknesses, and most importantly, the devastating truth about our grandfather's legacy that would destroy whoever was foolish enough to claim it. "I understand the terms," I said quietly, letting my voice carry just the right note of uncertainty. "When will the evaluation take place?" "The formal assessment will begin on your 21st birthdays and conclude 6 months before your 24th, Mr. Henderson explained. "The attorneys will review your business accomplishments, financial management, and contributions to family welfare." Marcus reached over and squeezed my shoulder with practiced brotherly affection. "Don't worry, Vic. We'll both do our best, and may the better candidate win." The lies came so easily to him, but then they always had. Our parents had died when I was 10 and Marcus was 12, killed instantly when their private jet crashed during a storm over the Atlantic. The official cause was pilot error, but I'd learned in my previous life that it was actually mechanical failure, a maintenance issue that grandfather had covered up to avoid liability lawsuits that might have exposed his business practices. We'd been sent to live with our mother's sister, Caroline Ashworth, in her sprawling estate in the Hamptons. Caroline had never married, never had children of her own, and had spent decades resenting our mother's perfect life. The beautiful husband, the successful career, the loving family that Caroline had never managed to build for herself. That resentment had transferred directly to us, but in the most insidious way possible. Caroline had lavished attention and praise on Marcus while systematically undermining and isolating me. It wasn't obvious abuse, nothing that would trigger intervention from schools or social services. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a masterclass in psychological manipulation that had shaped both of our personalities in devastating ways. Marcus got the master suite with the ocean view. I got the converted storage room in the basement. Marcus got private tutoring with Harvard professors. I got whatever public school would take me with my behavioral problems. When Marcus struggled with his studies, Caroline hired additional help and blamed the teachers for not understanding his unique learning style. When I excelled, despite having outdated textbooks and no support, she'd find ways to diminish my achievements. Victoria has always been so competitive, she'd tell visitors, shaking her head sadly while I sat right there. Desperate for attention. I worry about her becoming obsessed with proving herself superior to her brother. It's not healthy for a young girl. Marcus learned early that this dynamic served him well. He could be lazy, cruel, or irresponsible, and Caroline would make excuses. Meanwhile, any mistake I made was evidence of fundamental character flaws that needed correction. If something went wrong in the house, I was blamed by default. If money went missing, my room was searched first. If Marcus came home drunk or high, it was because I'd been a bad influence. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and relentless. Caroline would praise Marcus lavishly in front of me, then privately tell him that he needed to watch out for his sister's jealous tendencies. She'd give me tasks that were impossible to complete successfully, then use my failures as evidence that I couldn't be trusted with responsibility. She'd share intimate details about my struggles with friends and family members, always framed as concern for my well-being, ensuring that everyone saw me as the problem child. By the time we turned 18 and aged out of Caroline's direct control, the damage was complete. Marcus had learned that he could take whatever he wanted and someone else would clean up the mess. I had learned that nothing I accomplished would ever be enough, and that the people who claimed to love me were the ones most likely to betray me. The inheritance had changed everything by making our rivalry official and legally binding. In my previous life, I'd thrown myself into proving my worth with desperate intensity. I'd gotten my bachelor's degree in 3 years while double majoring in business and computer science. I'd started Victoria Tech Solutions in my dorm room with a revolutionary algorithm that could predict supply chain disruptions weeks in advance. By 21, my company was valued at $12 million and had contracts with the Fortune 500 companies. Marcus, meanwhile, had coasted on charm and family connections. He'd barely graduated from Columbia with a communications degree, spent 2 years backpacking through Europe on his trust fund allowance, then returned to start a consulting business that consisted mainly of networking events and expensive lunches. His biggest accomplishment was convincing 3 family friends to invest in a restaurant that failed within 6 months. When the family lawyers conducted their preliminary assessment at 21, the contrast was stark. I had built a legitimate business empire and was being profiled in Forbes as one of the top young entrepreneurs in the country. Marcus had a failed restaurant and a portfolio of unpaid debts. That should have been the end of it. But Marcus had always been better at reading people than reading spreadsheets, and he'd correctly identified that his path to the inheritance lay not through building himself up, but through tearing me down. The campaign had been subtle at first. Questions about my mental health raised with concerned family members. Suggestions that my success was coming at the cost of family relationships. Carefully planted stories about my obsessive work habits and inability to maintain friendships. He'd positioned himself as the brother who was genuinely worried about my well-being, who wanted to help me find balance before I destroyed myself with ambition. Meanwhile, he'd been building his own narrative. Marcus the people person. Marcus the natural leader. Marcus the one who understood that family legacy was about more than money. It was about relationships, tradition, and values. He'd started volunteering with high-profile charities, joined exclusive clubs, and cultivated friendships with influential people who might have the lawyer's ears. By 22, his strategy was working. My business continued to thrive, but whispers followed me everywhere about being difficult to work with and obsessed with control. Marcus's failures were reframed as learning experiences that had given him wisdom and humility. The family lawyers began to suggest that perhaps administrative control should go to the sibling who understood people skills rather than just technical competence. That's when Marcus had escalated to more direct sabotage. First, it was small things, important documents disappearing from my office, key investors receiving anonymous packages containing out-of-context photos and quotes that made me look erratic or unprofessional. Rumors spread at industry conferences about my company's financial instability or my personal drug use, lies that took weeks to debunk and left lasting damage to my reputation. Then came the bigger moves. A hostile takeover attempt by one of my competitors, funded by money that I later traced back to Marcus's offshore accounts. A series of lawsuits from former employees who claimed I'd created a hostile work environment. Employees who I discovered had been recruited and coached by a firm that Marcus had hired. A federal investigation into my company's tax practices, triggered by anonymous tips that contained detailed internal information that only someone with access to my personal files could have known. I'd fought back against every attack, but each defense had cost time, money, and energy that I couldn't afford to lose. My business began to suffer as I spent more time dealing with legal issues than developing new products. My personal relationships crumbled under the stress of constant crisis management. My health deteriorated from working 20-hour days and living on caffeine and anxiety medication. Marcus, meanwhile, had used the chaos to rebuild his own reputation. He'd positioned himself as the voice of reason, the brother trying to hold the family together while his sister spiraled out of control. He'd started a foundation focused on mental health awareness, giving speeches about supporting family members through difficult times. He'd been profiled in society magazines as an example of grace under pressure, maintaining his dignity while dealing with a sibling's public meltdown. By 23, the narrative had completely flipped. I was the unstable genius whose success was built on unsustainable practices and unhealthy obsessions. Marcus was the mature leader who had learned from his early mistakes and developed the wisdom necessary to manage a complex family legacy. The family lawyers had been leaning toward naming him as administrator when I'd received the invitation to that final dinner at the family mansion. Marcus had called it a reconciliation, a chance for us to put aside our rivalry and work together, regardless of who officially controlled the inheritance. He'd prepared my favorite meal, opened a bottle of wine from grandfather's private collection, and spent the evening talking about childhood memories and shared family values. I'd been so desperate for peace, so exhausted from years of fighting that I'd believed him completely. The arsenic had been mixed into the coffee, a slow-acting dose that would mimic a heart attack caused by stress and overwork. Marcus had timed it perfectly, waiting until I'd signed several documents that would simplify the inheritance transfer, then watching me die with the same cold calculation he'd brought to every aspect of our rivalry. But here I was, 16 again, with 7 years of foreknowledge and a burning desire for justice. This time, I would let Marcus win exactly what he deserved. The first phase of my plan began immediately after the will reading. While Marcus started plotting his path to inheritance, I started researching the true nature of what he'd be inheriting. Our grandfather, Edmund Blackwood, had been a masterful criminal who'd spent 40 years building an empire that looked respectable on the surface while being completely rotten underneath. The $47 million in assets came with hidden liabilities that would destroy anyone foolish enough to claim legal responsibility for them. Working under assumed names and using skills I'd developed in my previous life, I'd spent months digging into every aspect of the Blackwood financial empire. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The real estate portfolio included 3 properties built on illegal, toxic waste dumps that grandfather had covered up in the 1980s. The EPA had been investigating for years, but hadn't yet connected the contamination to our family. When they did, the cleanup costs alone would exceed $20 million, and the investment accounts were funded partly through money laundering operations that stretched back decades. Grandfather had been washing money for organized crime families, corrupt politicians, and international arms dealers. The FBI had been building a RICO case that would seize every dollar once they could prove the connection. And the family businesses included a shipping company that had been smuggling drugs, a construction firm that had been bribing city officials, and a charity foundation that existed solely to provide tax shelters for other criminal enterprises. Each one was under federal investigation by different agencies that hadn't yet realized they were all connected. The crown jewel of grandfather's empire, a chain of luxury hotels, had been built using undocumented workers who'd been housed in slave-like conditions. When that scandal broke, the civil lawsuits alone would bankrupt whoever owned the properties, but the most devastating secret was the tax situation. Grandfather had been evading federal taxes for over 20 years, using a complex network of offshore accounts and shell corporations. The IRS had calculated the total debt at over $60 million, not including penalties and interest. They'd been waiting for grandfather to die so they could go after the estate with full legal authority. Whoever became administrator of the Blackwood estate wouldn't be inheriting $47 million in assets. They'd be inheriting over $100 million in criminal liability, environmental cleanup costs, civil lawsuits, and federal tax debt. It was a financial death sentence disguised as a blessing. In my previous life, I would have discovered these secrets after becoming administrator, then spent years fighting to minimize the damage while Marcus enjoyed his freedom. This time, I would make sure he walked into the trap with his eyes wide open and his signature on every document. The second phase of my plan involved becoming everything Marcus expected me to be, the difficult, competitive sister who would fight him for control of the inheritance. At 17, I started building my business empire again, but this time with a crucial difference. Every success was designed to make Marcus more desperate to beat me, more willing to take risks to prove his superiority. I launched a new version of Victoria Tech Solutions, using my knowledge of future market trends to create products that would be revolutionary but ultimately unsustainable. I made strategic investments that generated massive short-term profits while creating long-term liabilities. I cultivated a public image of brilliance mixed with instability, success mixed with personal dysfunction. To the outside world, I looked like a prodigy who was burning out spectacularly. My company grew to be worth $15 million within 2 years, but industry insiders whispered about my erratic behavior, my impossible demands on employees, and my tendency to make enemies of potential partners. Marcus watched all of this with growing alarm and escalating ambition. Every article about my success drove him to work harder at building his own credentials. Every rumor about my instability convinced him that he could present himself as the stable alternative. I fed his ambition carefully, always giving him just enough information to make him feel like he was outmaneuvering me. When he decided to start an investment firm, I accidentally left research documents where he could find them, pointing him toward opportunities that looked lucrative but carried hidden risks. When he needed startup capital, I reluctantly contributed $2 million from my own accounts, money that I knew would disappear into fees and bad investments. Most importantly, I made sure Marcus believed that becoming a state administrator was not just about money. It was about validation, family legacy, and proving his superiority over the sister who had always overshadowed him. By 21, the dynamic was exactly where I wanted it. I was the brilliant but unstable heir whose success couldn't be trusted to last. Marcus was the mature, responsible leader who had learned from his early mistakes and was ready to guide the family into the future. The family lawyers were impressed by Marcus's growth and concerned about my trajectory. Marcus himself was confident that he'd found the perfect balance of building his own credentials while undermining mine. What he didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything. Phase 3 began on our 22nd birthday, when I started my campaign of apparent self-destruction. I began making increasingly erratic business decisions that tanked my company's value. I got into public feuds with investors and partners, burning bridges that had taken years to build. I started showing up to family gatherings drunk or high, making inappropriate comments and causing scenes that reinforced everyone's concerns about my mental health. Meanwhile, Marcus stepped into the role of concerned brother perfectly. He staged interventions, hired therapists, and publicly spoke about the challenges of supporting a family member through addiction and mental illness. His foundation's work on mental health awareness earned him recognition from medical professionals and social leaders. He was featured in magazines as an example of grace under pressure, maintaining his dignity while his sister spiraled out of control. The more I appeared to fail, the more Marcus thrived. His investment firm grew to manage $8 million in client funds. He joined the boards of 3 prestigious charities. He was invited to speak at conferences about ethical business practices and family responsibility. But every success was built on foundations that I'd carefully prepared to collapse. The investment clients Marcus had attracted were a carefully curated collection of criminals, tax evaders, and financial fraudsters. I'd used my previous life's knowledge of financial crimes to identify people who were either under investigation or about to be exposed, then engineered introductions that made Marcus look like their trusted advisor. The charities he'd joined were already under scrutiny for mismanaging funds and paying excessive executive salaries. When those scandals broke, Marcus would be painted as either complicit or incompetent. The business partners he'd cultivated were all people I knew would be arrested, bankrupted, or exposed within the next 2 years. When their crimes came to light, Marcus's association with them would destroy his reputation and trigger investigations into his own practices. Most importantly, I'd been gradually feeding him information about the inheritance that would make him more desperate to claim it quickly. Hints about tax advantages that would disappear if the transfer was delayed. Suggestions that I was planning legal challenges that could tie up the estate for years. Rumors that other family members were pressuring the lawyers to split administrative control between both siblings instead of choosing one clear winner. By our 23rd birthday, Marcus was convinced that he needed to secure the inheritance immediately before I could recover from my apparent breakdown and mount a serious challenge. That's when I revealed what I wanted him to know about the estate's hidden value. "Marcus," I said, cornering him at his birthday party with what appeared to be a moment of rare lucidity, "I need to tell you something about grandfather's will." He looked around nervously, checking to make sure no one could overhear us. "What about it?" "I've been doing some research," I said, swaying slightly as if I'd been drinking. "There are assets that aren't included in the official valuation. Offshore accounts, foreign investments, shell companies. The estate is worth way more than $47 million." His eyes sharpened with interest. "How much more?" "Maybe double, maybe triple." I leaned closer, lowering my voice to a whisper. "But there's a catch. The offshore accounts have strict transfer requirements. Whoever becomes administrator has to claim full legal responsibility for all estate assets within 30 days, or the accounts get seized by foreign governments." It was a complete lie, but it was exactly what Marcus wanted to hear. Hidden wealth that justified his ambition, combined with time pressure that meant he couldn't afford to wait or share control. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I've seen the documents," I said. "Grandfather hid them in his private safe. But Marcus, if this gets out, other family members might contest the will. Caroline, the cousins, even some of grandfather's old business partners. We need to make sure the transfer happens quickly and cleanly." That night, Marcus called the family lawyers and requested an immediate final evaluation. He was ready to claim his inheritance. Phase 4 was the endgame, giving Marcus exactly what he wanted. The final evaluation took place over 3 days in the family lawyer's Manhattan offices. Marcus presented his case with confidence and sophistication, highlighting his business growth, his charitable work, and his mature handling of family difficulties. His investment firm's portfolio looked impressive on paper. His character references were impeccable. His vision for the family legacy was thoughtful and comprehensive. I played my part perfectly, showing up disheveled and defensive, making rambling arguments about my past successes, while clearly struggling with substance abuse and mental health issues. I accused Marcus of sabotaging my business, made vague threats about legal challenges, and generally reinforced everyone's belief that I was too unstable to manage a complex financial empire. "The choice is clear," senior partner James Morrison announced on the final day. "Marcus Blackwood has demonstrated the maturity, stability, and business acumen necessary to serve as administrator of the Blackwood estate. Victoria, while clearly talented, needs to focus on her personal recovery before taking on such significant responsibilities." Marcus tried to look humble and concerned rather than triumphant, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He'd won. After years of competition, manipulation, and careful planning, he'd finally proven his superiority over the sister who had always overshadowed him. "I accept this responsibility with gratitude and humility," he said formally. "I promise to honor grandfather's legacy and to take care of my family, including supporting Victoria through her recovery." The paperwork was signed that afternoon. Marcus Blackwood became the sole administrator of the Blackwood estate, with complete legal authority over all assets, investments, properties, and business holdings. He also became personally responsible for all associated debts, liabilities, and legal obligations, including the ones he didn't know existed. The celebration dinner that night was held at grandfather's mansion, with Marcus playing the gracious winner and me playing the bitter loser who was drowning her sorrows in expensive wine. Caroline flew in from the Hamptons to congratulate her favorite nephew, along with a small group of family friends and business associates. At exactly 11:47 p.m., 3 black SUVs pulled through the mansion's front gates. The FBI agents who flooded through the front doors were led by Special Agent Sarah Chen, who I'd been feeding information to for months under my assumed identity as a financial crimes investigator. Behind them came representatives from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Justice's Organized Crime Task Force, and the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Marcus Blackwood, Agent Chen announced, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, tax evasion, environmental crimes, and racketeering." The look of absolute shock on Marcus's face was everything I dreamed it would be. "There has to be some mistake. I just inherited this estate today. I haven't done anything wrong." "Sir, by accepting legal control of the Blackwood estate, you've assumed full criminal and civil liability for all activities conducted using estate assets, properties, and financial instruments dating back to 1987, Agent Chen explained. "We've been building this case for 3 years. That's when they handed him the indictment. 63 pages of federal charges spanning 4 decades of criminal activity. Money laundering for organized crime families. Tax evasion through offshore shell companies. Environmental crimes involving illegal toxic waste disposal. Racketeering through a pattern of bribery, extortion, and fraud. Every crime that grandfather had committed using estate resources was now Marcus's legal responsibility. Every dollar that had been laundered was now money that Marcus had knowingly received. Every toxic dump site was now environmental damage that Marcus was liable for cleaning up." "But I didn't know," Marcus stammered as they put him in handcuffs. "I had no idea about any of this. My grandfather never told me." "Ignorance of ongoing criminal activity is not a defense when you voluntarily assume legal control of the enterprise," Agent Chen replied, "especially when you've been actively participating in money laundering through your investment firm for the past 2 years. Marcus's face went completely white as he realized what she meant. Every client I'd steered to his firm, every investment I'd helped him make, every business partnership I'd encouraged, all of it had been connecting him to the very criminal network that grandfather had built. He'd thought he was outmaneuvering me. Instead, he'd been building his own prison cell 1 brick at a time. The federal seizure was swift and comprehensive, every bank account frozen, every property placed under government control, every business asset tagged for forfeiture. The $47 million in assets that Marcus had fought so hard to control vanished in a matter of hours, but the liabilities remained his personal responsibility. $63 million in unpaid federal taxes, $28 million in environmental cleanup costs, $42 million in civil forfeiture penalties, $18 million in restitution to victims of the various fraud schemes, plus interest, penalties, and legal fees that would continue accumulating for decades. Marcus wasn't just losing the inheritance. He was inheriting a debt that would follow him for the rest of his life. The media descended on the story like vultures. Golden Boy heir inherits criminal empire. From riches to racketeering, the Blackwood family scandal. Trust fund baby becomes most wanted. How Marcus Blackwood inherited a life sentence. Every news outlet ran the same narrative. The charming, successful young man who had seemed to embody old money values and modern business ethics had actually been the heir to one of the largest criminal enterprises on the East Coast. His investment firm was revealed to be a money laundering operation. His charitable work was exposed as a front for tax evasion. His reputation for family loyalty was reframed as willingness to profit from illegal activity. The character witnesses who had vouched for him scrambled to distance themselves. The clients who had trusted him with their money demanded investigations into their own potential criminal exposure. The charities that had honored him announced internal reviews of their partnership with his foundation. Within a week, Marcus Blackwood had gone from golden child to public enemy number 1. But the most beautiful part wasn't the criminal charges, or the financial ruin, or even the complete destruction of his reputation. The most beautiful part was the way he looked at me as they led him away in handcuffs. For the first time in our lives, Marcus finally understood who the smart one really was. The trial lasted 8 months and was covered extensively by every major news outlet. Marcus's defense team tried everything: claims of ignorance, arguments about inherited liability, attempts to shift blame to grandfather's generation. None of it worked. The evidence was overwhelming, and most of it had come from documents and financial records that I'd been carefully preserving and organizing for years. Every transaction, every cover-up, every criminal connection was documented in excruciating detail. Marcus was convicted on 47 federal charges and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The judge was particularly harsh about his attempts to claim innocence while actively participating in the criminal enterprise through his investment firm. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Harrison said during sentencing, you have attempted to portray yourself as an unwitting victim of your family's criminal legacy. However, the evidence clearly shows that you spent years actively building connections to the very networks that your grandfather had established for money laundering and fraud. Your claims of ignorance are not only unconvincing, they are insulting to this court and to the victims of these crimes. Caroline tried to visit me exactly once after the sentencing, showing up at my new office in downtown Manhattan with tears streaming down her face and apologies spilling from her lips. She'd lost her own home when the federal investigation revealed that she'd been living in a property bought with laundered money and had been named as a co-defendant in several civil lawsuits. Victoria, please, she begged. You have to help me. I'm family. I took care of you after your parents died. I know I made mistakes, but you can't just abandon me. I listened to her for exactly 3 minutes, taking notes on a legal pad as she sobbed about losing everything and needing family support. Caroline, I said when she finally stopped talking, do you remember what you told me when I was 14 and asked why Marcus got to go to summer camp while I had to stay home and do yard work? She looked confused. No, I don't remember. You said that life wasn't fair and that the sooner I learned that lesson, the better off I'd be. I stood up and walked to my office door, holding it open. Consider this your lesson. Security escorted her out, and I never saw her again. The letters from Marcus started arriving 3 months into his sentence. The first few were filled with rage, accusations, and threats. He called me a traitor, a manipulator, a cold-hearted bitch who had destroyed her own family for revenge. He accused me of planning the whole thing from the beginning, of deliberately setting him up to take the fall for crimes he didn't commit. He was absolutely right about everything except the last part. Marcus had committed those crimes. Maybe not the original ones from grandfather's era, but definitely the money laundering and fraud he'd been conducting through his investment firm. I had simply given him the rope he'd use to hang himself. The later letters were different. As the reality of 25 years in federal prison sank in, the rage transformed into something that might have been genuine remorse. Marcus wrote about having time to think, to really examine his behavior and the choices he'd made. He wrote about understanding finally how much pain he'd caused me over the years. I keep thinking about that summer when you were 15, one letter read. When you won the state science fair and I convinced Caroline that you'd been cheating because there was no way you could be smarter than me. I watched you cry when she made you return the trophy and I felt nothing. I actually felt proud that I'd put you in your place. What kind of person does that to their own sister? I read that letter 3 times, looking for the manipulation, the angle, the way he was trying to use my emotions against him. But if it was there, I couldn't find it. Maybe prison had actually taught him something about accountability. Or maybe he'd just gotten better at faking sincerity. Either way, it didn't matter. The letters went into a folder in my desk drawer, unresponded to and unread after the first sentence. I had better things to do with my life than psychoanalyze the brother who'd tried to murder me, like living it. 2 years after Marcus's conviction, I stood in my corner office on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, looking out over Central Park as the sun set behind the city skyline. The brass nameplate on my door read Victoria Blackwood, senior partner, and the law firm of Chen, Blackwood and Associates had become one of the most respected financial crimes practices on the East Coast. My partnership with Sarah Chen had been a natural progression. She'd been impressed by the quality of financial intelligence I'd provided during the Blackwood investigation and had offered me a position as a consultant when she left the FBI to start her own practice. Within 6 months, I'd proven myself valuable enough to become a full partner. We specialized in cases that were similar to my family's situation, helping law enforcement agencies untangle complex white-collar criminal enterprises, assisting victims in recovering assets from fraud schemes, and providing expertise to prosecutors who were building RICO cases against organized crime families. It was satisfying work, and it paid extremely well. My starting salary was more than Marcus's entire inheritance would have been worth after taxes and legal fees. My annual bonus last year had been larger than the trust fund allowance we'd received as children. But the money wasn't the real reward. The real reward was using my knowledge and skills to help other people get justice against the kinds of criminals who had destroyed my family. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective James Rivera, who I'd been dating for the past year. "Dinner reservation at 8. Don't be late this time." I smiled, typing back, "On my way down." James was waiting in the lobby, looking handsome in his off-duty clothes, but carrying himself with the alert posture that marked him as law enforcement, even when he wasn't in uniform. We'd met when he'd been assigned to investigate a financial fraud case that intersected with one of my firm's clients, and had started dating after the case was closed. He was nothing like the men I'd dated in my previous life, ambitious Wall Street types who'd seen me as either a trophy or a threat. James was grounded, honest, and completely unimpressed by wealth or status. He'd grown up in Queens, worked his way through college, and joined the NYPD because he actually wanted to help people. Most importantly, he'd known about my family history from the beginning and hadn't cared. When other people looked at me, they saw either the brilliant lawyer who'd helped take down a criminal empire, or the sister who'd betrayed her own family for money. James saw me as Victoria, someone who'd survived trauma, built a successful career, and chose to use her skills to help other people seek justice. "How was your day?" he asked as we walked toward the restaurant. "Productive," I said. "We got the indictments we wanted in the Castellano case, and I think we're going to recover about 60% of what they stole from the pension fund." "Good," he said. "Those retirees deserve to get their money back." That was the difference between this life and my previous one. In my first life, I'd been surrounded by people who measured success in terms of personal wealth and status. Everything had been a competition, and everyone had been keeping score. Now I was surrounded by people who measured success in terms of justice served and problems solved. We were all working toward the same goals instead of fighting over the same prizes. It was a better way to live. After dinner, we walked through Central Park, enjoying the cool evening air and the relative quiet after the chaos of the city streets. James told me about a case he was working on involving identity theft, and I shared some ideas about tracing financial transactions that might help him identify the perpetrators. "Can I ask you something?" he said as we sat on a bench overlooking the reservoir. "Sure." "Do you ever regret it?" "What happened with your brother?" It was a question he'd never asked before, though I'd been expecting it for months. "You mean, do I regret that he went to prison?" "I mean, do you regret the way it happened? The planning, the manipulation, the fact that you could have warned him but chose not to?" I thought about it for a long moment, watching the lights of the city reflect on the water. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it." "Even though he's your brother?" "Especially because he's my brother." I turned to look at James, making sure he could see the certainty in my eyes. "Marcus spent our entire childhood hurting me and getting rewarded for it. He spent our teenage years sabotaging everything I tried to build. In my adult life, he escalated to serious crimes that destroyed my business and nearly killed me. I'd never told James about the rebirth, about dying and coming back with memories of the future. As far as he knew, I'd simply been more observant and better prepared than Marcus had expected. He made a choice every single day to be cruel instead of kind, I continued, to take instead of earn, to hurt instead of help. The inheritance just gave him a bigger stage to perform on. "But you could have stopped it," James said. "You could have exposed the criminal enterprise before he inherited it, saved him from going to prison." "And then what?" I asked. "He would have learned that his sister had protected him, and he would have resented me for it. He would have seen it as proof that I thought I was smarter than him, better than him. Within a year, he would have found new ways to hurt me." I stood up from the bench, needing to move while I explained something that most people would never understand. "Marcus didn't go to prison because I set him up," I said. "He went to prison because he chose to inherit a criminal enterprise, chose to launder money through his investment firm, chose to build relationships with criminals and fraudsters. I just gave him the opportunity to make those choices with full knowledge of what he was doing." James was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. "You really believe he would have kept hurting you?" "I know he would have," I said with absolute certainty. "Because that's who Marcus is. That's who he's always been. Prison might change him, therapy might help him understand his behavior, but At 23 years old, he was a predator who saw me as prey. The inheritance just made the stakes higher. We walked in silence for a while, James clearly thinking through the moral complexity of what I'd done. I didn't blame him for struggling with it. Most people wanted to believe that family meant something, that blood created bonds that couldn't be broken by cruelty or betrayal. I'd believed that once too. It had nearly gotten me killed. What about forgiveness? He asked finally. Don't you think people can change? I think some people can change under the right circumstances, I said. But I also think that some people are fundamentally broken in ways that can't be fixed. Marcus had 23 years to choose kindness over cruelty, honesty over manipulation, building over destroying. He chose wrong every single time. So you chose for him. I chose for me. I stopped walking and turned to face him completely. I chose to protect myself from someone who had already proven he was willing to destroy me. I chose to stop being a victim and start being a survivor. I chose justice over family loyalty. James studied my face in the lamplight, looking for something I couldn't identify. And you're at peace with that choice? Completely, I said. Are you? It was the real question, the one that would determine whether our relationship had a future. James was a good man who believed in justice and protecting the innocent, but he also believed in redemption and second chances. If he couldn't accept that some people didn't deserve those chances, then we were fundamentally incompatible. Yes, he said after a long pause. I think I am. 3 years later, I stood in the same park wearing a white dress and holding a bouquet of white roses. James looked nervous and handsome in his tuxedo as he waited for me at the altar that had been set up near the reservoir. Sarah Chen was my maid of honor, and James's partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, was his best man. And it was a small ceremony, just 30 people who actually mattered to us, rather than hundreds of acquaintances trying to be seen at the right social events. My guest list included colleagues from the law firm, prosecutors and agents I'd worked with on major cases, and a handful of friends I'd made through volunteer work and professional organizations. Notably absent were any members of my biological family. Caroline was in prison serving a 5-year sentence for conspiracy and money laundering. Marcus was still in federal custody with 20 years left on his sentence. Various cousins and distant relatives had tried to reconnect once my success became public, but I'd made it clear that the Blackwood family name died with grandfather's criminal empire. I'd legally changed my name to Victoria Sterling 6 months after Marcus's conviction. The new name represented a new life, built on my own accomplishments rather than inherited wealth or family connections. As I walked down the aisle, I caught sight of a familiar face in the small crowd. Agent Chen's former partner, who had worked on the Blackwood investigation, was recording the ceremony on his phone with tears in his eyes. Later, he would tell me that watching me build a happy, normal life was one of the most satisfying conclusions to a case he'd ever experienced. You look beautiful, James whispered as I reached the altar. You clean up pretty well yourself, I whispered back. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. We'd written our own vows, focusing on partnership, honesty, and building a life based on shared values rather than shared history. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, James kissed me with the kind of joy that I'd never experienced in my previous life. That night, as we danced at our reception in a small restaurant that James's family had been going to for 3 generations, I felt something I'd never expected to feel. Complete contentment. I wasn't the richest person in the room, or the most successful, or the most powerful. I was just a woman who had survived trauma, built a meaningful career, and found love with someone who saw her as an equal partner rather than a prize to be won or a threat to be eliminated. It was everything I'd never known I wanted. The honeymoon was a 2-week trip to Italy where we spent our days exploring ancient ruins and our evenings eating incredible food while planning our future together. James wanted to buy a house in Queens near his family. I wanted to expand the law firm and take on more pro bono cases for victims of financial crimes. We were lying on a beach in Positano, watching the sunset paint the cliffs in shades of gold and orange, when James's phone buzzed with a message. Work? I asked. Personal, he said, looking at the screen with a confused expression. It's from someone claiming to be your brother. My blood went cold. What does it say? He says he's being released early for good behavior and wants to meet with you. James handed me the phone so I could read the full message. It was from an email address I didn't recognize, but the writing style was unmistakably Marcus's. Formal, carefully crafted, designed to sound reasonable and non-threatening. Dear Victoria, it began. I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to inform you that I'm being released from federal custody next month as part of a new program for nonviolent offenders who have demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. I've spent the last 5 years in therapy, education programs, and reflection about the harm I caused to you and our family. I would very much like the opportunity to speak with you in person, not to ask for anything, but simply to apologize and to try to make amends for the pain I've caused. I understand if you're not ready for that conversation, but I wanted you to know that I'm truly sorry for everything I put you through. I hope you found happiness and peace in your life. With sincere regret and hope for reconciliation, Marcus. I read the message 3 times, analyzing every word choice and sentence structure for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. It sounded genuine, but Marcus had always been skilled at sounding genuine when it served his purposes. What do you think? James asked. I think my brother has had 5 years to plan exactly what he wanted to say to get me to lower my guard, I said, and I think he's gotten very good at it. You don't believe he's changed? I think prison has taught him to be more careful about how he presents himself, I said, but I don't think it's changed who he fundamentally is. James was quiet for a moment, watching the waves crash against the rocks below us. What are you going to do? Nothing, I said. I'm going to delete this message and enjoy the rest of our honeymoon. And if he tries to contact you again? Then I'll deal with it when it happens. I handed the phone back to James and settled against his chest, focusing on the warmth of the sun and the sound of the ocean. But I'm not going to let the possibility of Marcus disrupting my life actually disrupt my life. That became my philosophy for the next 2 years. Marcus tried various methods to contact me. Letters forwarded through mutual acquaintances, messages sent through professional contacts, even hiring a private investigator to find my home address. Each attempt was polite, respectful, and focused on his desire to apologize and make amends. I ignored all of them, not because I was afraid of him, or because I thought he posed a physical threat. After 5 years in federal prison, Marcus was undoubtedly more cautious about breaking laws that could send him back to custody. But because I had learned the most important lesson of my previous life, I didn't owe him anything. I didn't owe him forgiveness. I didn't owe him a chance to explain himself. I didn't owe him the opportunity to ease his guilt by apologizing to his victim. I didn't owe him access to my life, my happiness, or my peace of mind. Marcus had made his choices. I had made mine. The consequences of those choices belonged to each of us individually. My law firm continued to grow and prosper. James was promoted to detective lieutenant. We bought a house in Queens with a small garden where I could grow vegetables and herbs. We talked about having children someday when we felt ready to bring new life into the world we were building together. It was a quiet, normal, deeply satisfying existence that bore no resemblance to the dramatic, competitive, wealth-obsessed life I'd lived before. On my 30th birthday, James surprised me with a weekend trip to a cabin in the Adirondacks. We spent our days hiking through forests that were just beginning to show their fall colors, and our evenings sitting by a fire reading books and planning a vacation to Japan for the following spring. On our last night, as we were getting ready for bed, I found an envelope that had been slipped under the cabin door. My hands shook as I recognized Marcus's handwriting on the outside. "What is it?" James asked, noticing my reaction. "A letter from my brother," I said. "He found us here." The implications were chilling. Marcus had not only discovered where we were staying, but had traveled to a remote location to deliver a message personally. It was exactly the kind of boundary violation that demonstrated he hadn't learned to respect my clearly stated wishes to be left alone. James was immediately alert, his police training taking over. "Did you see anyone outside? Any cars that didn't belong?" "No," I said, "but if he's here, he's been watching us." "We're calling the local police," James said, reaching for his phone. "Wait," I said. "Let me read it first." The letter was longer than his previous attempts, and the tone was different. Less formal, more emotional, with an undercurrent of frustration that he was trying to control but not entirely successfully. Victoria, it began, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I can't accept that our relationship is permanently severed. We're family, and family means something. I've spent 5 years paying for my mistakes, learning to be a better person, and trying to understand how to make amends for the harm I caused. But I can't complete that process without your participation. The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing his therapy sessions, his educational accomplishments in prison, his plans for rebuilding his life as a productive member of society. But the central message was clear. He believed I owed him forgiveness, and my refusal to engage with him was preventing him from moving forward with his life. I've tried to respect your space, the letter continued, but it's been 2 years since my release, and you haven't even acknowledged my attempts to reach out. I understand that you're angry, but at some point, we need to have an adult conversation about how to heal our family relationship. I'm not asking you to forget what happened, just to give me a chance to show you who I am now. The letter ended with an ultimatum disguised as a request. I'll be staying at the Pine Lodge Motel until Sunday morning. If you're willing to meet with me for just 1 hour, I promise I'll respect whatever boundaries you set after that conversation. But if you continue to ignore me, I'll have to assume that you're not acting in good faith, and I'll need to explore other options for resolving this situation. Other options for resolving this situation. It was a threat, carefully worded to sound reasonable, while making it clear that my continued refusal to engage would have consequences. This was the Marcus I remembered, charming and reasonable on the surface, but fundamentally unable to accept that other people had the right to make choices he didn't like. We're definitely calling the police now, James said after reading the letter. Yes, I agreed, but first I want to call Sarah. Sarah Chen answered on the second ring, despite it being nearly midnight. Victoria, what's wrong? I explained the situation quickly, reading portions of the letter aloud and describing the pattern of escalating contact attempts over the past 2 years. This is stalking, Sarah said immediately. The fact that he tracked you to a remote location and is demanding contact while making veiled threats puts this well outside the realm of normal family reconciliation attempts. What are our options? Legally, you can get a restraining order based on this behavior pattern. Practically, you need to document everything and prepare for the possibility that he's going to escalate further when you continue to refuse contact. You think he'll get violent? I think he's demonstrating a pattern of behavior that suggests he believes he's entitled to access to your life regardless of your clearly stated preferences, Sarah said. That's the mindset that leads to violence when other methods of control fail. We called the local police, who took the report seriously and sent officers to check the Pine Lodge Motel. Marcus was registered there under his own name, and the officers informed him that any further attempts to contact me would result in charges for harassment and stalking. According to their report, Marcus had seemed surprised and hurt by the accusation, insisting that he was just trying to reconcile with his sister and didn't understand why wanting to apologize was being treated as a crime. It was exactly the response I would have expected. Marcus had always been skilled at positioning himself as the victim whenever his behavior was questioned. We cut our weekend short and drove back to the city that night. On Monday morning, I filed for a restraining order that prohibited Marcus from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, my workplace, or any location where I was known to be present. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Marcus appeared with a lawyer and contested the order, arguing that he had a right to attempt reconciliation with his sister and that his behavior had been well within the bounds of normal family communication. His lawyer presented character witnesses who testified about Marcus's rehabilitation in prison, his commitment to therapy, and his genuine remorse for past mistakes. They painted a picture of a man who had paid his debt to society and was trying to rebuild relationships with his family in a healthy way. My lawyer presented a different narrative, a pattern of escalating contact despite clear rejection, boundary violations that demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for my autonomy, veiled threats that suggested potential violence if his demands weren't met. Your Honor, I testified, my brother spent our entire childhood establishing a pattern of taking whatever he wanted from me regardless of my consent. He spent our adult years escalating to criminal behavior that nearly destroyed my life. His current behavior demonstrates that prison has not changed his fundamental belief that he's entitled to access to my life on his terms. But he's your brother, the judge said. Don't you think family relationships deserve special consideration? With respect, Your Honor, being related to someone doesn't give them the right to stalk, harass, or threaten you, I replied. I have the same right to be free from unwanted contact as any other victim of persistent harassment. The judge granted a temporary restraining order and scheduled a follow-up hearing for the following month. That night, Marcus violated the order. I was working late at the office when building security called to inform me that a man matching Marcus's description was in the lobby asking to see me. When they told him I wasn't available, he'd become agitated and demanded to know when I would be back. James arrived within 10 minutes, along with two uniformed officers who arrested Marcus for violating the restraining order. As they led him away in handcuffs, he shouted loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear, "She's my sister! I have a right to talk to my own sister. This is insane!" The headlines the next day were predictable. Blackwood heir arrested for stalking sister. From prison to restraining order, Marcus Blackwood's continued legal troubles. Family feud escalates. Brother charged with harassment. The media coverage was largely sympathetic to me, portraying Marcus as someone who couldn't accept that his criminal past had consequences for his relationships. But there were also articles questioning whether I was being too harsh, whether family forgiveness might be more healing than continued legal battles. I didn't care about public opinion. I cared about safety, boundaries, and the right to live my life without being terrorized by someone who refused to accept that his apologies weren't welcome. Marcus was sentenced to 6 months in county jail for violating the restraining order. His lawyer argued for probation, but the judge noted that this was his second violation of court orders within a week, and that a message needed to be sent about respecting victims' rights. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Williams said during sentencing, "your insistence that family relationships supersede legal boundaries demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of both the law and healthy relationships. Your sister has made her position clear through multiple channels, and your refusal to respect her autonomy is exactly the kind of controlling behavior that led to your original criminal charges." The 6 months passed quietly. Marcus served his time without incident and was released with a renewed restraining order that would remain in effect for 2 years. I heard nothing from him for 8 months. Then, on a cold Tuesday morning in February, I received a call from Detective Rodriguez, James's former partner. "Victoria, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Marcus was found dead in his apartment this morning." The world seemed to stop moving. What happened? "Apparent suicide. He left a note." I sat down heavily in my office chair, trying to process what I was hearing. "What did the note say?" I can't share the specific contents, but the general message was that he couldn't live with the guilt of what he'd done to you and couldn't accept that he'd never be able to make amends. So even in death, Marcus had found a way to make it about me. His final act was designed to ensure that I would spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved him by being more forgiving, more understanding, more willing to give him the absolution he'd demanded. It was his last manipulation, and it was masterfully crafted. "Victoria?" Detective Rodriguez's voice brought me back to the present. "Are you okay?" "Yes," I said. "I'm okay." And I was. I felt sad that Marcus had chosen death over the hard work of building a life without my forgiveness. I felt angry that he'd tried to make his suicide my responsibility. I felt relieved that I would never again have to worry about him violating restraining orders or tracking me to remote locations. But I didn't feel guilty. Marcus had spent 32 years making choices that prioritized his needs over everyone else's well-being. His final choice was consistent with that pattern. The funeral was small. Caroline attended via video call from prison, crying dramatically for the cameras. A handful of distant relatives showed up, along with a few people from his therapy group in the halfway house where he'd been living. I didn't attend. James asked if I wanted to, and I considered it briefly. But ultimately, I decided that I'd said everything I needed to say to Marcus through my actions over the previous decade. My presence at his funeral wouldn't change anything about our relationship or provide closure that I didn't already have. Instead, James and I spent that afternoon at home, cooking dinner together and talking about our plans for the spring garden. It was exactly where I wanted to be. 6 months later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a letter in Marcus's handwriting, apparently written before his death and mailed by someone else on a delayed schedule. It was 15 pages long, single-spaced, and filled with the kind of detailed psychological analysis that Marcus had always excelled at. He wrote about understanding, finally, that I would never forgive him. He wrote about accepting that some harm couldn't be undone through apologies or good intentions. He wrote about recognizing that his continued attempts to force reconciliation had been another form of the same controlling behavior that had defined our entire relationship. I've spent the last year in therapy trying to understand why I couldn't just accept your decision and leave you alone, he wrote. My therapist helped me see that demanding forgiveness was just another way of making everything about my needs instead of yours. Even my desire to apologize was selfish. I wanted to feel better about what I'd done regardless of whether it would help you heal. The letter went on to describe the specific ways he'd hurt me throughout our lives, demonstrating a level of self-awareness that was both surprising and heartbreaking. He'd understood exactly what he was doing and why it was wrong, but had been unable to stop himself from doing it anyway. I know that you'll probably see this letter as one final manipulation, he concluded. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm so broken that I can't even apologize without making it about me. But I want you to know that I finally understand what you've been trying to tell me. You don't owe me anything. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not even grief at my death. You gave me more chances than I deserved, and I wasted all of them. The fact that you were strong enough to protect yourself from me is something I admire, even as it destroyed any hope I had of earning your forgiveness. I hope you live a beautiful life filled with people who see your worth and treat you with the love and respect you deserve. You were always the better person, Victoria. I just wish I'd been smart enough to admit that before it was too late. I read the letter once, folded it carefully, and put it in the fireplace. As I watched the pages burn, I felt a sense of completion that I'd never expected to experience. Marcus had finally understood what I'd been trying to teach him for decades: that actions have consequences, that relationships require mutual respect, and that some harm can't be undone through words alone. He'd learned the lesson too late to save himself, but he'd learned it nonetheless. The flames consumed the last of his words, and with them, the last connection between my present and my past. I was finally completely free. That evening, James found me in the garden, planting tomato seedlings in the raised beds we'd built together the previous summer. The sun was setting behind the city skyline, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of better times and brighter futures. "How are you doing?" he asked, kneeling beside me to help with the planting. "Good," I said, and meant it completely. "I'm good." "No regrets?" "None," I said. I made the choices that were right for me, and Marcus made the choices that were right for him. I'm sorry he couldn't find a way to live with the consequences of his actions, but that was never my responsibility to fix. James nodded, understanding in the way that only someone who truly knew me could understand. We worked together in comfortable silence as the stars appeared overhead, building something beautiful and productive from the rich soil beneath our hands. And in my previous life, I died believing that family meant sacrifice, that love meant accepting abuse, and that forgiveness was something I owed to people who hurt me. In this life, I'd learned that family meant choice, that love meant respect, and that forgiveness was a gift that couldn't be demanded or earned through manipulation. I'd learned that justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was simply about refusing to let other people's dysfunction define your life. Most importantly, I'd learned that the best revenge wasn't destroying your enemies. It was building a life so beautiful and fulfilling that their absence from it felt like a blessing rather than a loss. As I tucked the last seedling into the soil, I smiled thinking about the harvest we'd have in a few months. Fresh tomatoes for summer salads, herbs for cooking, flowers for the table where James and I would share meals and plan our future together. It would be a future built on trust instead of betrayal, partnership instead of competition, and love instead of obligation. It would be everything Marcus could never have given me, and everything I'd finally learned I deserved. The garden would grow, and so would we. And that was the most perfect ending I could have imagined.